Concerning IPCC report out of the United Nations, basically, unless we have greenhouse gas emissions in 3 years, we are going to set off a chain reaction that is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to reverse, of increased, hurricanes, natural disasters in general, as well as certain ecosystems falling apart and our planet irrevocably changing. So, I mean, kind of serious. NatGeo here writes about the 4 urgent takeaways from this climate report. To limit warming to manageable levels, the world has only a few years to stop using fossil fuels completely. Unless global greenhouse gas emissions peak no later than 3 years from now and are cut nearly in half by 2030. Okay, so they can, I misspoke a bit earlier. They can peak no later than 3 years from now, but they have to be cut in half by, in less than a decade. The world will likely experience extreme climate impacts, according to the latest report from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. According to the report, if urgent action is not taken, humanity will fail to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, the threshold for a future of more fires, drought, storms, and more. Greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere are at their highest levels in human history. Emissions of the gases fell sharply in 2020 as a result of the pandemic lockdowns, but in 2021, they equaled or even surpassed the record in 2019, when they were about 12% higher, than in 2010, and 54% higher than in 1990. 54% higher in 1990 when the IPCC report was first published. This is like the one silver lining that is cited in this IPCC report. The rate of increase in greenhouse gas emissions was slower between 2010 and 2019 than over the previous decade, and technologies and policies do now exist that would enable sharp reductions in the emissions if the political will exists to implement them. Like, we're in this country kowtowing to a guy in Joe Manchin who's upset that we're not returning to coal, who's upset that we are not using more coal to help himself out financially, by the way, and burning more coal and contributing to climate change to that degree. And this is like treated as I don't know, there's both sides to this debate in this country, which is just insanity. And like, the budgeting that Biden is proposing in terms of climate mitigation doesn't even approach or come close to approaching what is necessary to do here. For there to be any hope of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the use of coal must be slashed by 95% worldwide. So, as we're having a debate on whether or not, to what degree we should use coal in this country, right? I mean, it's a good side. One side says this, one side says that. We're all in agreement that some coal has to be used. I mean, this is America, right? No. 95% slashing is necessary if there's any hope of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. While consumption of oil and gas has to be reduced by 60% and 45% respectively by 2050. Fortunately, for many people in many places, installing new clean energy is cheaper than operating existing fossil fuel energy, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it is getting cheaper, but the point is that the leaders specifically in this country, and that's where we're primarily focused because we are a podcast that operates in the United States and because the United States disproportionately contributes to climate change. There is not an all-out blitz in the way that there should be to get these technologies to be more widely used. And I'm sure that whenever that time does come, there will be some massive cultural backlash because gas is inherent to, Christian values or something like that. From 2010 to 2019, the cost of both solar and lithium-ion batteries declined on average by 85%, while that of wind energy decreased by 55%. Such declines have enabled significantly more widespread deployment of these technologies, except not like deployment that's proportionate with that price decrease, frankly. Additionally, the report notes that the funding of renewable energies falls well short of what is needed and, in fact, continues to pale in comparison to the subsidies given to fossil fuels. It concludes that just ending such subsidies could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 10% by 2030. Yeah, but, we're worried about the executives over at ExxonMobil here. Deep and rapid cuts to methane emissions are also critical. NatGeo writes, one of the most effective ways to do so is to target fugitive emissions, methane that escapes into the atmosphere during the extraction and transport of natural gas, or from long abandoned oil wells. Yes, if anybody has read anything about these old oil wells that crop up throughout the country, which are both biohazards to communities, but also incredibly, wasteful or dangerous areas that are old oil wells that are still releasing a ton of methane, like there needs to be a deliberate shutdown of those, and the Biden administration should prioritize that. I think it's pretty dangerous to do so, but that's why the government needs to fund money to do so safely. Because not only is it contributing to climate change to this degree, it's also hurtful to communities, as I mentioned. The IPCC calculates that fugitive emissions account for about 32% of methane released into the atmosphere globally, and 6% of all greenhouse gas emissions. CO2 removal will be a key stopgap with caveats. So you can read more about this IPCC report and what is recommended here. This NatGeo piece has kind of like a 4 bullet point recommendation. Summary of the IPCC report. But the bottom line is that we are not on track or even close to the standards that we need to meet in order to go down a path where we have no way of getting back in terms of the effects of climate change. And I know that that's depressing, but this is part of the issue with the fact that we elected a weak centrist as our president, and the fact that before him, the president Trump, he slashed shredded the Paris Climate Accord, which didn't even go far enough at all. And neither of these presidents have made any meaningful step forward in terms of our mitigation efforts and cutting down on greenhouse emissions or methane emissions. So,
I mean, that we're exactly where we would be, understanding that the oil industry for over a century has been basically a instrument of, I don't know what you want to call it, fascism maybe, whether from like Standard Oil, or you look at literally who was fueling the planes for Franco in the Spanish Civil War, the planes that were provided by Hitler. It was Texaco Oil from the US. Or whether it's BP in Iran. Like these industries are the ones that need to be partners in any sort of coups over the past hundreds of years. And that's why we don't have a real democracy here either. Our democracy is a complete sham, because this isn't a real debate among people. This is the debates you see on cable news is a simulation designed to obscure the reality that we have these powerful interests that have basically controlled governments by violent means or sort of covert means of just money influence. And they have foreclosed democracy to the extent that we might not be able to save the planet from ecological destruction. And so like the idea that they could be partners, no, we need to get to a point where we are nationalize these people and treating them like the outlaws they've been acting like for 100+ years.
Yep. I mean, and like, again, this is at the forefront of the debate in terms of Russia and their invasion of Ukraine right now. And yet we're not having an existential question about our reliance on oil and gas. Like, the EU is maybe going to adopt a resolution that bans Russian coal. Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. Right. Like, OK, that's fine in terms of like a reaction to what we're seeing in Ukraine and to the invasion. But this is why I was hard on Jen Psaki when she was answering these questions from Ducey and other right wing journalists about what's it going to do to gas prices if we impose these sanctions and et cetera, when really it's like Russia's invasion that has set gas prices to this degree. Like you have to reset the conversation, and you have to say, well, no, this is why we need to get off of fossil fuels, because our reliance on this is a national security liability. She can phrase it that way. And it's also untenable because we are at the whim of these petrostates and these massive countries that are very oil rich. And it creates insecurity among the general population here. And we could, instead of just drilling more here, we could think a little bit more. We could think big for the first time ever and try to implement a Green New Deal. And yet, we get, none of that. We get none of that. The fact that we have a Democratic president and we're not talking about climate change like this, I mean, at least once a week, and they're not resetting the conversation in that way. I mean, it's depressing.
The reality of the situation is they don't plan to address it. The Joe Biden and those folks, they don't plan to address it. It's going to be mitigation, all mitigation, and trying to, get whoever on the ark that you can.